Even though I did this 100 times, I still get a little something. Let me have another one. A couple.
Oh,
Okay.
I like that.
Yes, timeline.
Oh, thank you.
Beautiful. Hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, no, it's fine. All right. You got friends that are gonna be that want to hear this too. Tell them to come. This is the right time to text them. Let them know we're getting started soon. All right. Everybody ready? Are we good? Yeah. All right, everyone. So thank you all for coming to this panel. I know that when I was looking at the list, I'm like, okay, we're up against a number of different issues and topic areas that I know are important to a lot of us in this conference. And so I've been here since this morning. I wasn't able to be here on Thursday and Friday, but in listening to all the conversations from this morning, I now know how important this particular conversation around closing jails, prisons, and detention centers is to this broader conversation around the theme of this conference, right, which is us moving beyond this concept of having people behind cages or being in jails or institutions in general, right? And so the conversation of closing facilities in any context is a very a multifaceted issue. Is an issue that has a variety of different conversations that need to be had. And so I'm going to begin by introducing myself and allowing all of my fellow panelists. And so I'll be playing a moderator role, but I'm also going to speak on the issue of closing youth prisons in particular, since that's near to my heart. So I'm going to give myself an opportunity to, again, to try to speak from time to time. And so I want to put that out there because I don't want people to assume I'm trying to take space or time. But I am trying to cover an issue as well as allow everybody here to speak on their issue and to speak on the topic as well. And so I'm going to begin by saying that my name is Hernan Carvente Martinez. I am the Youth Partnership Strategist at the Youth First Initiative, and we're a campaign of campaigns, and so we're essentially an initiative that focuses on building campaigns to close youth prisons and reinvest that money in community alternatives. And I've only been out 7 years, and so when I got out 7 years ago, this conversation around closing prisons was like the radical thing to say, right? It was like the taboo thing to say. It's like, oh nah, like that's the radical person you don't want to be next to, right? And so 7 years out, and I'm here with an esteemed panel that we're all talking about this right now. It's a conversation that we're having, not just behind closed doors and trying to strategize behind closed doors, but there are active campaigns with such visual presence that is really making us actively think about all of this. So I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to go down and introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Lex and then work my way back down.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Lex Stepling. I'm the Director of Policy and Campaigns at Dignity and Power Now in Los Angeles, California. And we're also an anchor organization of the Justice LA campaign, which I'm sure many of you know successfully stopped 3 jails in the past calendar year, and we'll talk more, obviously. That's why we're here, to talk more about what that's looked like. We're an organization that, of course, tries to do abolitionist-driven organizing, but we also provide direct services and support and healing work for families who have been harmed by the jail system. That can be in the form of the probation department, that can be in the form of the jail itself, that can be in the form of the sheriff's department, and ultimately it all falls under the term that we lead with, which is that we're against state violence.
Thank you, Lex.
Hi, everyone. My name is Barbara Suarez Galeano. I use she and they pronouns. I'm the organizing director for Detention Watch Network. We're a national organization of organizational and individual members working to end immigrant detention. And essentially our work currently is like 2 campaigns. One of them is getting at the appropriations process at the federal level to defund ICE and CBP. The other part is supporting local fights that are either fighting to stop proposed detention center expansions or shut down existing detention centers.
So good afternoon. My name is Marilyn Wynn, and I am the Executive Director of Women on the Rise Georgia from Atlanta, Georgia. And our organization is led by formerly incarcerated women of color. We are leading the way to close and repurpose, not just close, but repurpose the facility, Atlanta City Detention Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and to end broken window policing and keep our folks out of cages.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Reuben Jones. I'm the campaign coordinator for Close the Creek in Philadelphia, where we have successfully lobbied, advocated, and organized to close 2 county jails in Philadelphia. We still got about 5 more to go, but we're getting there. And like Ms. Wynn, we don't just want to close them, we want to demolish those jails and reinvest the savings back into communities impacted by mass incarceration.
Thank you. So, I think there are some themes that already start popping up, as you all are introducing yourselves, right? That it's not just a conversation about closure. It's not just a conversation about getting rid of these institutions, right? There is this conversation that ultimately is about either repurposing or reinvestment, right? And so as we're thinking about this and as we're sort of setting the stage for everybody in this room to sort of fully grasp the magnitude of some of these campaigns, I'd like for each of you to sort of take a moment to just maybe describe more in detail what has actually taken place in order for some of your campaigns to actually be where they are now. Because, we didn't just one day build a base and all of a sudden, push for a bunch of changes and say, we're going to close this institution down. And then ultimately a bunch of people showed up to the steps of City Hall or wherever and make it happen, right? And so maybe, Ruben, you can lead us in that piece first. And just tell us a little bit more about Close the Creek and what it's taken to get to that place.
Yeah, definitely. First, I want to shout out Ms. Marilyn because she brought this cool timeline. And all I do is make notes, write stuff on paper. So I just learned a lot today that we got to really kind of contextualize our work through some nice flyers like that. But so the campaign actually started around 2014. The city of Philadelphia wanted to purchase land to build a new jail, right? So at the time, much like Rikers, Philadelphia has a campus of county jails, except it's not on the island. It's in the far northeast region of the city by the Delaware River. So those decisions often come quietly without any community input, right? So the minute we learned about it, we started pushing back against the city. We started meeting with city council and the mayor's office around, hey, this is not a good decision. This is not a good look. We already felt our communities were over-policed. In Philadelphia, there's a huge racial disparity in the criminal justice system. 9 out of every 10 people that's incarcerated in Philadelphia are black and brown. 90% racial disparity, which is ridiculous, right? So during that process, we did successfully lobby for them not to purchase this land. But part of their reason, part of their rationale was the House of Correction is old, it's decrepit, it's unsafe, we need to tear it down. The House of Correction was originally built in the 1800s, slave era, 1874-ish, and we agree, it is old, it is decrepit, it is unsafe. So it needs to be torn down, and it doesn't need to be replaced. So their pushback was for us to close the jail, we need to reduce the population by a specific amount to justify it. So at that point, this is before the MacArthur grant, we started exploring ways in which we could do that. Our tool began to be bail reform. So if we could get rid of cash bail, which currently, again, disproportionately impacts people of color and brown people, black and brown people, then we could get more than 30% of the jail, almost 40% of the jail out. The remaining 55, 56% was there because of probation detained, probation violations. So we could actually decarcerate by about 75 to 80% just by ending cash bail and probation detaining. So we took a trip down to Washington, D.C. to look at their pretrial services. They ended cash bail back in the 90s. We thought that was a good plan, at least a strategy to follow. Some of our city council agreed. They came back, spent about 2 years of doing nothing, just kind of talking. They passed a resolution, no real action. So 2 things happened. One, the city applied for the MacArthur grant. They got it to reduce the jail population by 34% over 3 years. They exceeded that right now. It's about 44%. Larry Krasner got elected. He ushered in an era of reform through his progressive politics, stopped asking for bail for 25 misdemeanor charges. So the population now sits around 4,900 people, which sounds great. We started, it was around 9,500, right? 95, 96. But the reality is we've been stagnant for about the last almost year, 8 to 10 months with that number because the city hasn't been as progressive as they pretend to be. But the way we got there was through ground level community organizing, coalition building, engaging elected officials, and really pushing back at City Hall really hard. At one time, I was tweeting at the mayor really hard every day until he like, yo, y'all need to come here and talk. Because we weren't trying to build relationships or make friends with them. We wanted to let them know that we're pushing from the outside to create change. And then the city tried to kind of undercut our momentum by announcing the jail closure a week before our big launch for the Close the Creek campaign. So it was very deliberate, very intentional, but we didn't stop. So we continued to work in coalition with other folks. Obviously, when you work in coalition, everyone doesn't always agree, and we end up having those kind of, family fights, if you will, and that thing kind of fell apart. But the good thing was we were able to really push City Hall to work towards those changes during the interim. And so the House Correction closed April 18-ish, and Triple C, which is a smaller facility, closed roughly 6 or 8 months later. So because of that diminished population, we were able to justify them, closing another facility. However, the mayor has identified a savings of about $15 million from the House of Corrections alone. The city's sitting on a $400 million surplus. So, and a lot of that comes directly from the DOC budget, the Philadelphia prison system. So our big challenge right now, two things actually, is to get them to actually commit to demolishing this jail, right? It's over 100 plus years old, and put those savings back into communities where, like Lex said, those direct services that make up the needs that folks ended up not having to send to prison in the first place. So that's kind of my spiel in a nutshell. Yeah.
Thank you, Ruben. So, Marilyn, could you give us some context for what's going on in Atlanta, and just give us a real sort of how we get to that aspect of repurposing as well, right? Because that wasn't the initial conversation, but how we got there, the process.
Okay, so we got there by repurposing. When the vision to close the jail came up, I'm a true believer if you don't put something in place of something closing, that it can reopen. If another mayor should come in and decide, just like it is, Fulton County is actually overcrowded. And they're trying to put pressure on our mayor now to let them use it, but we are pressuring her more that this is not going to happen, and she has agreed that it will not happen. So the thing to repurpose it is for the people that was harmed in the jail, they still don't have a place to go to get the services they need. The $32.5 million that is being that it takes to operate the jail can actually go back into the community to give these people the service that they need. Actually, they know where the jail is. They don't have to look for it. So we're hoping that building be torn down, repurposed into something that is welcoming, and not just welcoming, but open, a place of light, structure, different, where people want to come and get those services. So I'm hoping, and we are hoping, that it becomes a one-stop shop where people can find everything that they need. So that is the purpose for the purpose for repurposing this building for the folks that the jail has once harmed, that they can come and get healing as well. And it's not just those people, but it can be family-oriented, community-oriented, and this is a campaign that is community-led. And so that's why the reason for repurposing.
And
So
Marilyn,
that money can be reallocated back into the community.
when we start talking about some of the sort of challenges that people, as you're saying, repurposing, are people buying that off the bat? Are they pushing back against the idea? What are some of the challenges that you're experiencing in that conversation?
Well, there were challengings about what people want people in jail. They think because people committed a crime, they go to, they need to be in jail. But what they don't realize is the people not going to die in jail. They coming back. I'm formerly incarcerated. Until I got the services that I need, I kept going to jail. So we do town halls, we do meetings with neighborhood community centers, we do meetings with our MPUs. We constantly educate our community on the necessities and the needs of people getting services. I don't believe in jails, period. If a person commits a crime, it's the reason why that person commits a crime. But don't nobody ask what you do, why you did this, or try to address that problem. If you don't address the problem, the person gonna keep committing the crime. It's not going away. It goes away when a person gets what they need. So those are the challenges of where we got people and we got developers, because that is a prime area. Our jail is 471,000 square feet, 14 stories high, sitting in the middle of downtown. So it's prime areas right there, I-20, 85, it's easy access to the highway. I mean, it's in a prime area. So yeah, we got developers wanting it, but by the grace of God, we got a mayor that has been impacted by the system through her father, that she knows how the pain of families being separated. She knows the pain of children and families needing to be together. So the pushback we got is from the community. Of course, we got our Buckhead community, again, that still want to see people in jail. But the thing is, what we're doing is keep educating. Is you never get enough for educating. And we're doing it with people that have been impacted by the system. I don't care how many books you read, how many colleges you've been through. If you ain't been impacted by the system, you can't change it. So that is what we're using, and that is the tool we're using to make a difference.
Awesome. Thank you, Marilyn. Barbara, this topic, right? When we talk about even repurposing, oftentimes whenever we don't repurpose a facility, oftentimes what it then used for is for a detention center, right? And we've seen this not just in the adult justice conversation, but in the youth justice conversation in particular as well, right? Where we've had undocumented young people, but also unaccompanied minors being housed in detention centers that at one point might have been an actual correctional institution or a youth prison, and because it wasn't repurposed or wasn't, utilized in some way, has now been used under ICE, right? Or ICE has actually taken control over it. And so, did you want to say something, Mara?
Yeah, I do. As far and with ICE, we was grateful because our mayor has been impacted. She has her kids are adopted. So when 45 decided he wanted to separate children from their families, she said no more ICE contracts. She immediately stopped it. A day after it showed on TV, I think about 2 days later, it was a emergency news bulletin go out that she was stopping ICE contracts. That was a big help to us as well. So we have no ICE contracts there. Yeah.
Thank you, Marilyn. So, Barbara, and on that note, right, can you give us sort of a more intentional perspective on that particular piece, the immigration context, and just detention centers in general, right? How are we actively doing on that front? Because that's actually a topic that even I have very little knowledge of. And again, my parents are undocumented too, and it's not something that I'm actively, up to date with. So we would love to hear a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's really scary right now. I mean, the context is really tricky, particularly because for us, like folks in the migrant justice front, we're confronting the Trump administration on one of their top priorities, right? And what we found is a peeling back of this facade of a liberal democracy where, going to city council before used to work, getting a statewide legislation passed before used to work. And now we're seeing that when it's a priority of the federal government, particularly controlled by such a xenophobic person, none of that matters. They're gonna go ahead and do whatever they can to circumvent the victories that we have and take advantage of the silos that we work in. Unfortunately, the migrant justice movement has historically been very anti-Black. And that has meant a big fracture between folks who are doing criminal justice work or criminal reform work and the migrant justice movement. And ICE has done a great job of profiting from that and taking advantage of that. I think a huge example is this repurposing of facilities, of closed down prisons that have not been demolished or given a different use. One example is in California, we did hard work to pass this legislation called AB 32 that passed at the end of last year that was supposed to phase out private immigrant detention in the state. That's not happening right now, and actually ICE is doubling down, and in the town of McFarland is trying to expand detention with 2 closed down prisons. And so that presents a challenge, and thankfully there's a big base of farm workers that have been organizing for a long time that are working to stop that, and actually got the Planning Commission to vote it down for now, but obviously ICE is appealing. And then one of the other big loopholes that ICE is profiting from in terms of expanding immigrant detention is successful campaigns to end cash bail. In Louisiana and New Jersey are 2 of the states where we've seen the most expansion of immigrant detention in the country, and that's because a lot of cages were emptied when cash bail reform went through, and then ICE came in and said, we'll pay you more for those empty cages to detain undocumented people. So in Louisiana and New Jersey, that's how expansion has happened. There's been no construction of any new detention centers, or what we call dedicated facilities, under the Trump administration. All the expansion has happened through county jails and contracts with county jails that take advantage of all of the federal money that ICE has. So yeah, it's a big learning opportunity for us right now, and we're trying to actually push our membership and push the migrant justice movement to rethink these relationships with folks who are doing work against mass incarceration, to acknowledge the hurt that anti-Blackness has created in our movement, and to talk about the fact that Black folks are receiving 7 times harsher sentencing and deportation decisions when it comes to their status as undocumented folks, and they are not talked about. They're very much invisibilized in the context of migrant justice, and when people talk about this, they think oh, it's just a Latino issue, and it's not. A lot of Black folks are getting deported at higher rates, and Southeast Asian folks. And yeah, I could say a lot about that, but what I'm saying is there's a lot of spots where we've made a lot of mistakes as the migrant justice movement that we're learning right now, and really have to solidify our relationships to other folks and bring out the lessons that folks who have successfully fought against jail closures have learned and can share with our movement, with the onus of we're gonna show up for them as well. We're not just gonna take lessons and thank you, bye, but we have to think about how we're building with each other and learning from one another.
I think part of what you're saying now is also what I'm hoping everybody in this room is understanding, right? We're here to paint a picture of what's happening, and for all of you to take strategies for how to take that back to wherever you're coming from, right? And ultimately to rethink about how we're talking about in the larger context of our individual work, how it all ties into this, right? Because anti-Blackness is very much contributed to a lot of this issue, and you've made that very clear to us. And I think we don't oftentimes frame it in that way, or we don't even think about it in that way. And oftentimes that's the thing that creates a loophole for other folk or government actors to really just use that as a tactic against our people, and that ultimately is creating a more of a vortex that others get caught up in without us sort of really being intentional about it. And so Lex, maybe you could share now a little bit more about some of the work that you've been engaged in, and also maybe some of those lessons learned, some of those strategies that have come from some of that.
Yeah, thank you. And I see a lot of LA faces in the audience, and literally every single one of you guys has contributed to what I'm about to talk about. So it's kind of nice to have some of that collective presence here. You mentioned earlier context, and context really is everything, because if we're organizers and we're assessing the conditions that we are working in, we have to assess the context not just as what we're facing today, but what historical forces brought us there. Los Angeles County is the largest jailing county in the largest jailing state in the largest jailing country in the world, and it's not even close. And I say that because we're stepping into a scope where if anybody was going to start from a point of trying to compromise or be incremental or chip away, that's like chipping away at an iceberg. And it's a really futile and pyrrhic thing to do, and it leaves a lot of people behind. And so our starting point has to assess the fact that LA, though it's thought of as kind of a progressive metropolis, it is in the sense of the orientation of the community. Person by person, demographically, Los Angeles is a very radical place as far as the individual politics of the community. Institutionally, Los Angeles is the birthplace of the neoconservative movement. It's the birthplace of militarized policing. It was initially built to be kind of a white Western outpost where essentially proto-fascist policy was laid forth. And it's kind of the original alt-right in the 30s and 40s was born in Los Angeles. That's who built the institutions that we live in. And so the kind of centrist liberal politic of California that's skated by for the last 20 years was enabled by the fact that they could be socially progressive, at least on the top line, while relying on these very, very right-wing and reactionary and racist institutions to continue doing business as usual. And we had to be very honest with that and demand accountability from our partner organizations and from the kind of historic gatekeeper organizations statewide and locally to say we're going to address the problem in that context, not from something that may have been convenient or politically expeditious for the mayor, for example. And so we're looking at a county in Los Angeles that incarcerates over 17,000 people on any given day. For context, for more context, number 2 in the country is Harris County, Texas. That's Houston, it's 10,000. We're almost twice the size of the second place jail in the country. When that has been the reality, what we also are facing is, like I said, a legacy of state violence that targeted everybody. So we're not going to subscribe to a bookended sense of possibility that comes from whatever we've acquired around what is the criminal justice reform movement or what is single issue organizing or what a legislator or a system actor is going to tell us what's possible. We inherited a set of conditions where a $4 billion planned jail expansion on top of this largest jail in the world that I just mentioned, a $4 billion planned expansion had already been voted on by the County Board of Supervisors. So when we showed up and said stop that jail expansion and massively decarcerate the leading jailer on the planet, they said, why are you even here? It's already been voted on. Let's try to kind of work around the edges and mitigate some of the harms if possible, which often looks like things like budgeting huge sums of money back to probation, back to the sheriffs to do things like mental health or social work. And as we know, that doesn't ever happen, ever. That money, maybe if it's bookmarked for mental health services, literally goes into things like overtime. Never, ever in the history of ever has that money ever landed in the hands of care. And so it's foolish for us to let that become the text of a reform and say, oh, look, something good happened. So we showed up and we said, we are open to collaborating, but there will be no compromise. We want to get somewhere transformative together. And effectively, what our vision is the idea, and what we feel is a very feasible idea, that we can transform completely away from a system of jailing and punishment-based policies into a system of what we're calling in Los Angeles community-based systems of care. The long and short of it is that we won. We stopped the jail expansion plan. We canceled the contract. They tried to re-up and create a mental health jail. We stopped that one too. They tried to build a women's jail. We stopped that one too and had it to be replaced with public housing. Lots of, there's so much is contained in that story, so I can't get into all the granular details. And lots of work went into those, but also we recognize, and this is, I feel like the question that you're asking, is that we can't stop this forever. We can't sustain the impact if we treat those like victories and then leave and go do a victory lap. The county implemented what was called the Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group, which was essentially them saying, you stopped this massive thing that we didn't think could be stopped, and now what do? We had been submitting proposals throughout the year saying, we believe this is the kind of roadmap out of this into something much better. And so we call them kind of like our Justice LA reports. Justice LA Decarceration Report. I'm looking at Isaac because he helped me write it, among other people. The Justice LA Decarceration Report. And we, again, felt like every county has a public health department. Every county has a mental health department. Every county has a health services department. A lot of places don't have diversion programs. Some do. New York is way ahead of the game as far as the size of their diversion network. I'm not saying it's all good, but it's bigger and more prolific than other places, and it's certainly more funded. LA, for a jurisdiction that big, had very little, had one small, tiny pilot program. But we did say there is a thing where diversion is happening, and that's one of your answers right there. So we kind of cobbled together a bunch of the answers, and we also said in some cases, it's not always about replacing something with something, it's about replacing it with nothing. Pretrial detention needs to not exist, period. The notion that we have for so long accepted this kind of civic reality like the post office, that people sit legally innocent in jail while they await trial, it's way past cash bail. Because we saw in California, they passed a horrible piece of legislation called SB 10, which effectively replaced cash bail with enhanced power of probation, enhanced judicial discretion with no recourse, and algorithmic-based risk assessments. It's a nightmare. If SB 10 gets implemented, and it was many in our advocacy field who also supported it, if it gets implemented, it will expand our jail population with no valve of release while being celebrated as something where, well, we disempowered the bail industry. So we realized we can't settle for a cash bail conversation. It has to be a pretrial incarceration conversation, with the reality being that the notion that legally innocent people sit in jail is incredibly backwards, and when we stop and think about it, it's very unacceptable. And so we tried to frame all of this as not radical, but very sensible solutions. To make a very long story short, we arrived at, through that ATI process, a very holistic document called the ATI Work Group Recommendations that are going to be voted on March 10th. So everyone, I was going to be like, if you're in LA, come, but all of you guys will be there. And we want the county to celebrate the fact that they commissioned such a process where we all sat at the table, probation, sheriffs, all the health departments, us, all sat at the table and engaged in an incredibly democratic process, an incredibly rigorous process for 6 months, arriving at the finalized set of recommendations, which is, to me, one of the most forward-looking one of the most forward-looking documents that I think any jurisdiction has ever produced, and they can be proud of it. They commissioned this process. Now they have to vote on the recommendations. If those recommendations get put in place, then our next task is to organize the implementation of it, to steward the implementation of it. But then quite literally something will have happened where the biggest jailing county in the world will be transforming from a jailer into a comprehensive public health model. And so it's an incredibly revolutionary thing that has reached a point of possibility that now we're trying to organize over the edge. And I'll finish by saying that going back to your question, we couldn't treat this as a single issue thing. We have to do pretrial, we have to do organizing around pretrial. We have to do organizing around public health and innovative public health models. In a place like LA, we have to talk about houselessness. We have to talk about public health harm reduction models. We have to acknowledge that public health harm reduction models have worked 10 times out of 10 forever, and that the only problem has been that a huge segment of the community doesn't get access to them because they're under the supervision of the courts. We have to try to eliminate probation. We have to try to abolish pretrial detention, or none of these things will sustain. And then instead of that, and the last thing I'll say is that too many reforms right now are looking for quick solutions, and also solutions that contain profit-making opportunities. And that's why migrant communities are getting used and sacrificed in this. And that's why you have something like the First Step Act, which has then completely enabled billions of dollars to go back into private detention targeting migrants. And the people who celebrated First Act saying, well, it's great that Donald Trump isn't doing Willie Horton-style talking points anymore, but he is. He's just targeting migrants now. And so we cannot look away from any of that if we move forward. So it's been an incredibly holistic effort, one where, and it's in our top line of kind of our organizing mantra that we have collectively at Justice LA, which is leave no one behind.
Thank you, Lex. So, you know, Lex, one of the themes of the previous panel, the plenary of y'all were in this room, was around the solidarity piece, right? And how we need to be actively advocating on a variety of different issues, right? I'm actively currently doing work around closing youth prisons, and much like what you all have said, we're experiencing the same challenges in the youth justice realm of trying to close some of these institutions down. And I feel like every time I'm in a conversation around closing a youth prison, it always turns into this dynamic of if we're repurposing it, what is it, right? What is it going to actually look like? If we're actively trying to say, we have all of these strategies to get to that ultimate closure point, what are the strategies that we need to employ in some of that, right? And I think, for us at Youth First, we've been able to support 6 states currently to build campaigns to close youth prisons, and we're actively now on our way to partnering with 3 other states. And ultimately, in all of these states, the work has looked very differently, right? In some, you have a task force that's actively now trying to rethink the ways in which, the systems are working. And who oftentimes is on these damn task force? All of the people who work in the system, and barely anyone who's been directly impacted, right? And so majority of the conversations in some of those has been actively our partners sort of forcing their way onto the task force and saying, this is what we demand as directly impacted people and members of the community. In other states, we've gotten to the point of closure, and then all of a sudden we're experiencing this whack-a-mole syndrome, right? In Virginia, we've been doing this game now where after the facility closed out there, and there's been an active conversation of now closing the next one, now all of a sudden the Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice wants to build facilities left and right in different cities, right? Actively picking cities that are like far removed from where the young people are coming from in the communities where they're most like, again, where all of the resources should be for their families and for them. And so I think as we're thinking about some of these closure conversations, one of the things that we're grappling with too at Youth First is, who are the partners that we have as we're doing this, right? Are we willing to compromise at any point? Is there a compromise to this larger vision? And I know in the previous panels, we've been trying to sort of unpack that, right? Where does the compromise happen, if at all? And that advocacy and organizing, to be honest, is not for the faint of heart, right? Like it takes a lot to be able to achieve some of these milestones. And so, Ruben, maybe you can sort of get us to that conversation a little bit around what have been some of the partnerships, what have been some of the compromises, and do we need to continue making some of those compromises, or is there an important conversation that needs to be had in this room around that?
Wow, you picked me for that, huh? So compromise is hard. And I just want to be fair and respectful to everyone when we talk about coalition work. Lex hit on something that's very important about agendas and about authenticity. And we talk about Black-led movement, we talk about directly impacted movement. Everybody can't wrap their head around that in terms of those people, that population being empowered. So whether you're talking about immigrants, migrant workers, Black people, formerly incarcerated, women, oftentimes, we're disempowered, we're marginalized, right? So when it comes to decision making and having power, and somebody mentioned agency over your own self and community, that's a concept that's often lost on elected official and quote unquote mainstream leaders. I just want to be clear about that. So, and I hate this phrase, if you ain't at the table, you're on the menu. The reality is people will invite folks to appear to be at that table making decisions when you're no more than window dressing, right? So let's be clear about that. The other thing that you mentioned, and I wrote this down, was about we can't focus on short-term wins or perceived wins. This is a protracted struggle that's literally never going to end, because every time that we make progress or we change something or we shut something down, guess what's going to happen? They're going to come back with a new iteration of whatever the thing is that started way before any of us was born, and I'm talking about slavery. The current prison system is nothing but an extension of chattel slavery, and as soon as we wrap our brains around that and understand it is rooted in institutional racism, we will realize what we're up against. So we can't clap and applaud and take bows because one jurisdiction changed the bail laws, or one jurisdiction closed the jail, or somebody else, whatever, because they're going to come back. So I don't know what your question is, but I wanted to get that out, right? Because I want to be clear. It's frustrating, right? It's frustrating to be a formerly incarcerated Black man in this country, right, fighting for the freedom of our people, and having other people come and determine what that freedom looks like. Come and determine what change or transformation looks like. Am I right? So we have to be careful. I will share a couple of examples. And, you know, the SB 10 being one of them, right? But right now in Florida, you know, how many of you were at the convening with all of us or none, I guess summer before last, right? You know, more than 1,000 folks down there. You know, I think they knocked on something like 50, 60,000 doors, about 80 phone bank, 70, 80,000 people, right? And this is all around voting, restoring the voting rights of formerly incarcerated people. And when it came through, I gotta admit, you know, I'm a hypocrite. I celebrated. I was like, yo, we got one, right? But then what happened? Right? Then they talk about fines and fees. Oh, you guys can't vote. We're not gonna give you that power, because the minute that we exercise that power, we determine the outcome of every election in this country. From the local city elections, your state elections, on up to the presidential election. And they understand what that power looks like. They understand what it means when marginalized populations unite. The Africans have a proverb to say, when spiders, how's it go? I forgot. When spiders unite, they could top the lion, right? Something along that line. But you get the point. What? She said, I don't know. What you talking about? What you talking about, Willis? But, I mean, the point is simply, we have more power than we recognize. And I think that getting caught up in perceived victories, short-term victories, it's a disservice to the work that we have to commit to on an ongoing, long-term basis. So, ask me your question again.
You went into it in 100 different ways.
All
You
right,
know, part of what I'm really trying to sort of paint the real broad picture in this room for is like, what have been the hard compromises that we've had to make to get to this point, right? And Lex, you raise your hand, maybe you have some thoughts, but I really do want to open it up for all of you to share some of that.
Just quickly, really quickly, because you mentioned coalition building, you know, and I framed earlier about Los Angeles having this like real gap between how and who and what constructed the institutions we do it with versus the composition of the community. And that huge gap is part of why LA explodes the way it does sometimes. But what it also means is that there's, I think, for us around the question of coalition building, is that I think we're told a lot that we have to reach across the aisle, or that we have to build relationships, or that we need to you know, create a unified movement, for example. First of all, those are all subjective terms, and they can mean whatever they want to whomever's using them. But what I mean to say is that it's not about a billionaire donor. It's not about a celebrity endorsement. Those things should be in response to whatever you're doing and not the other way around. We're not leading sanctioned work. We are making demands, and those demands build points of gravity, and that point of gravity gets followed. But it's only followed if there's a genuine recognition, and this might sound cliche or something, a genuine recognition that the power lives in our community. We will never have the money or the resources of our opposition. What we do have is the power of the people. And there's a subtext in these kinds of spaces, not this specific conference, but in these institutionalized, professionalized spaces, in the consultant class that often reaches into our movements. There's a subtext that says the community is a marginalized entity and not as powerful as the kind of white supremacist power structure that's offering you crumbs.
Call it like it is.
And so there's no coalition to be built there. Our power lies in our community. If we build an activated and organized and informed base, and I don't mean thousands of people, it could be 20 well-mobilized people. If we build a strong and aligned base that's ready and consistent and informed, we literally always win, because they will follow. A lot of times they're ambivalent, or yet to be educated, or simply not understanding. We build things that be followed. If there's harm that happens to us along the way, you know, I'm not here to speak on that, but I'm saying that we still win. And so I wanted to just quickly, because I felt stimulated about the question of coalition building. We build coalitions community first, and if folks want to support, they're welcome to support, but we're not, what we say about our allies at the county, we say take their information, not their advice.
Thank you, Lex. Yeah, Marilyn, please.
So with Atlanta, we built not a coalition, we built an alliance. But if you look at this paper right here, at May 2019, it says legislation to close and repurpose. But down in the bottom of it, it says we got a vote 11-1 to build a community-led campaign. Everything that we do is done with the community. It is transparent. I am the co-chair of the mayor's board of this task force. I have members and members and alliance members that are sitting on each one of those boards where I'm not in the room, so we can guide what's going on. We realize that fact that coalitions and not being a part of the process, we won't win and we won't know what's happening. It'll be just like what is said here. It'll be just like, okay, you think you win. But in this model right here, the community is half of the community, at least 30 community members is our task force. And when it comes down to the final, when we give the mayor her 3 proposals in April, this is led by the community. She will not be able to make a decision. The community will make the decision on how this building is torn down, whether it's going to be torn down, repurposed, whatever happened to this building, the community is making that decision, not the mayor and not me.
Community-led effort all the way. Barbara, can you give us also some context in terms of the sort of the organizing power that has happened in the space that you have been a part of so far? Because I think we're hearing it's very quickly just getting into the criminal justice sort of conversation and some of these other facilities that have existed, right? But I think part of what has always been interesting is when you mentioned earlier about us sort of operating in this very anti-Black framework, right? That we haven't necessarily been intentional about how we talk about some of these issues in a way that is building coalition, but that's ultimately building that also solidarity with folk who are, again, in the immigrant-based community, right? Because we also heard in the previous panel some of this sort of fear-based narrative that has existed, or when at some point we were painting the narrative of, non-violent offenders can easily go and get a second chance versus, someone like me who was charged with attempted murder, I'd have been the outcast of most of the policies. And in New York, oftentimes we are the outcast of most of the policy, right? So I do want to sort of like give you an opportunity perhaps to sort of give us some of that from your perspective, but also really being sort of very intentional about how we continue to build a much more intentional narrative that brings that detention piece into this. Because again, we're not actively doing that in every conversation, and I feel like we need to, and I don't know how. What is the best way to do that?
Well, I definitely don't have all the answers. I think we're building that together. But I think that some of the better models that we've seen in terms of like folks who are trying to bridge with particularly a criminal justice like reform movement, or folks who are trying to dismantle prisons, is like starting at like our most criminalized and marginalized migrant folks and working to the center from there. Because I feel like many times the migrant justice conversation is about families or children or women, but like majority of the folks incarcerated in detention are men, single men. And many of them do have a criminal record, and so it's really important to build from there and to talk about, like, for example, in Chicago, it's not just about detention, it's about the gang database. It's about like a multiplicity of ways that we end up in detention and being criminalized. I think one big problem that we're trying to address right now is not just the assimilationist mentality in migrant justice work, where it's like we could buy ourselves into whiteness, right? Like eventually we're just gonna have citizenship and it'll be okay, where it's like that's not the point and that's not really what's gonna change things. But also a transactional understanding of what coalition is like, oh, you show up for this, then I'm gonna show up for that, and then when this project is done, we're done, instead of thinking about the community and empowering folks and the centrality of folks who are currently detained and people who have lived through detention, and how we're building a popular education framework that incorporates that. So yeah, I feel like for us right now, it's making sure that folks understand this as a long-term commitment that's not just gonna end once this detention center is closed or once we stop this one proposal, but we're building a community that's constantly working with each other and ready to jump into action when a proposal comes up, not just like dormant until there's a moment of urgency, which unfortunately currently in the migrant justice movement, it's a total moment of urgency. No one wants to think about anything beyond the like next 3 months or like the election and all of that. So it's like pushing to think about how we're incorporating our movements in a long-term process and not just till we elect a new president or till we figure out what's happening with a particular locality.
Thank you, Barbara. So, I and as I'm listening to all of you, I'm like mentally taking notes for the youth justice movement, right? Because again, most of what we're talking about here in some way or another applies to the work that I've been doing. But I do want to sort of unpack a little bit and to sort of be on a more intentional power building note, right? That a lot of the efforts that have like been talked about here have been led by directly impacted folk, right? We have been at the center of many of these conversations, oftentimes not by choice, but because of necessity, right? Then we need to stand up for ourselves. And I think, Ruben, you mentioned it too, right? That power, oftentimes when we're like face to face with some of these legislators or some of these folk who have, quote, the power on their hands to decide whether or not some of these institutions either exist or are eradicated, we're oftentimes faced with this idea that, we have a base of people, but that it always has to bring in the people who've actually set foot in some of these institutions. And so what has been the role of directly impacted people for all of your campaigns, right? In leadership, in the strategy, in the communication aspect of it? I'd love to hear from each and every one of you on that particular piece.
So for our campaign, it's led by I'm directly impacted. I spent 15 years in prison. One of the first people I hired was a person who was a juvenile life who spent 29 years in prison, right? The next person was a community organizer, but the person after that was someone whose brother spent substantial time in prison. So we believe, and we practice what we preach, right? So we're not hypocrites. At the end of the day, when we go to the table, we're going to the table because our expertise has a very distinctively different look. So to give you an example, Lex said we willing to collaborate but not compromise, right? So we're right now at the table about this probation bill in Pennsylvania. And it started with the Meek Mills case, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, so I won't recount those details. But for us, the crux of the bill was about creating caps for probation. So people were now on probation for 10 and 12 years. Well, guess what? We're working in this coalition. I won't mention some of the names because I'm sure you guys know some of them. But some of these organizations, FAM, I'm sorry. Some of the coalition, ACLU, some of the other members, I keep forgetting, but isn't, I'm sorry, Reform Alliance, one of those members. But when they come to the table, they're willing to say, we're ready to abandon caps because it's a no-win in PA, because we have these other things at play, Commonwealth Foundation. So we're just sitting there as the only directly impacted people who are saying, no, the whole reason we're here is because of caps. And if we abandon the very premise that we came to the table for, then we have no credibility. Not only not in our communities, but not in this legislature either. So it makes no sense. We can work with you until we decide that it's no longer working for us, and then we can move. So that's one example I want to share. And again, I won't name names because we know
No names.
no name. But at the end of the day, we organize inside the prisons. So we have in PA they have like a Lifers Foundation. They have all these different organizations inside the prison. So we actually go into the prison, meet with these organizations, really do political education around the myriad of issues that we're fighting, and get them to engage their families. So it's the same strategy we use for the Larry Krasner election. So we engage directly with the folks inside to get them to see the light, so to speak, to inform their families on the outside who then can mobilize. So that's other way. Then we also organize with organizations within the community that serve and represent or are led by directly impacted people. So we're not saying that you don't have to collaborate with folks who are not directly impacted, who are not don't have Black-led organizations, but we are saying that you have to stay focused, right, on what your agenda is, or you will be co-opted by someone else's agenda. So for us, it means I have a different feeling when I come to the table representing the interests of formerly incarcerated people because it impacts me directly. First of all, I'm still on parole, right? So anything that I bring to the table is also kind of selfish, right? Because I want changes for my life, right? But also still have a lot of friends and family members who are still incarcerated. So we are fighting to get people out of prison, then we'll never reach this number, this magical number we're talking about, by whatever. You know what I mean? So we got to be cognizant of that.
Thank you, Ruben. Marilyn, in Atlanta, can you give us some of that context too, like the role that formerly incarcerated or directly impacted people have played?
Yes, of course, it's basically the same as Ruben. I'm formerly incarcerated. My organization is led by formerly incarcerated women. Formerly incarcerated women of color. People that I hire are people coming out of the system, people that's been in the system. I do believe the closest to the problem can solve the problem. And we organize, the organizers go out into the community. They meet formerly incarcerated folks. We got on our website, if you've been arrested, you can come to our office and get a $200 welcome home package. We're reaching out to formerly incarcerated individuals however we can, in any way we can. And that building, that alliance is what we build, because when you build a coalition, then the coalition has a say-so into what's happening. Alliance don't have that say-so, but they can show up with their folks. So we build alliances with organizations, reentry organizations, any type of organization that is dealing with formerly incarcerated individuals or incarcerated individuals. I go into the prisons as well and recruit women on the inside. We have participatory defense. We do support groups, and we have monthly meetings where we educate formerly incarcerated women on different resources that they need, how to do this or how to do that. So we're always available, because we know that being formerly incarcerated, sometimes you just can't sit up in no meeting because you got needs. So we try to meet some of those needs. We're now about to open a clothes closet, so we can have these folks coming in and collaborating with another organization that we started, which is called Pre-Arrest Diversion. So we're going to combine and have a food closet. We're trying to reach formerly incarcerated folks because they got power. We want to educate these women, basically, because there's nothing that's offered to us when we come out. Men can stand on the corner and work at Home Depot and get handyman work. We stand on the corner, they think we're selling something. So other than, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So we want to educate folks, and we bringing women in any type of way and educating them, and bringing, like I have two here, sitting here, bringing them to these type places so they can get leadership development skills, get more skills, learn that there are people in the world that is doing this work that supports them and give them the power and energy to want to do this work. So we just building up women, girls, and trying to keep the movement going, and let them know that we got power, because we got it. It's us. It's our time. I got 3 here. I have a member and 2 staffs. So, but yeah.
That's dope. Barbara?
Yeah, so for us, as a national network, it works a little bit differently because we're not the ones that are like leading the fights on the ground. But we do have a like national cohort of people who have lived through detention that we are working with, not both on the angle of healing and political education. Because for many folks, you know, like, and particularly in the immigrant detention context, unfortunately, historically, like the nonprofit industrial complex there has been like completely white, and a bunch of quote unquote well-meaning lawyers who know everything about detention, supposedly. So yeah, we're trying to break away from that and talk and move away from a model where folks who have been detained are only called upon to speak about their horrible histories of pain, re-traumatized in the process, and then ask, please sit down so an expert could give us some analysis on what's happening in detention. So for us, it's that leadership cohort, it's a lot about providing folks with resources to heal, providing a model for all of our members to follow, with like having cohorts of leadership of people who have lived through detention, and definitely the centrality of political education, because many times we've seen, like, especially lawyers, come in against a shutdown fight and using the families that are living through detention to be the mouthpiece to say, we don't want our people transferred away, so we're against this shutdown, without having a critical conversation with the family about what a movement to end detention looks like, what we're trying to do to rethink the issue of transfers, and the fact that transfers only happen under ICE's discretion. That's not our fault that a transfer happens when a shutdown takes place. So yeah, it's a lot of that, and trying to highlight the campaigns that are already doing this. For example, in Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, there's a lot of organizing happening, not just with people who are formerly detained, but folks who are currently detained, who are constantly going on hunger strikes to call for the closure of the detention center. And I think that it's really important to highlight that under the Trump administration, we've seen the highest number of hunger strikes happening in detention, which you wouldn't think, because you would think that folks who are detained are very scared about the likelihood of like violence and transfers and everything that happens, particularly under this administration, but they're being bold and creative and putting themselves and their lives on the line in a, like, at a level and at a frequency that we hadn't seen before. So that requires us to be as bold, as creative, and as courageous in our work outside of detention. So yeah, for us, it's been that, and also modeling the need to pay folks, to give them resources. That, like, you can't expect people to turn out to a conference if you're not giving them stipends and, like, redistributing the resources that unfortunately have only gone to professional activists and organizers and lawyers, and not to the communities who are actually living through that suffering. So yeah, for us, it's been a lot of that, and highlighting that model to push people to engage with folks who have been currently detained in the same way, and cutting resources from folks who aren't doing that. It's like, if you're doing a shutdown fight and there's no people who have lived through detention around there, and there's like no conversation around that, then like maybe we are not on the same place. Like, yeah, you might want to shut down, but it's not under the terms that are actually going to have transformative repercussions for the community and for the movement at large.
Thank you, Barbara. Lex, can you give us some of the LA context too?
I think with qualifying everything by there's no monolith about, you know, what an impacted or non-impacted person is going to do. But I think fundamentally speaking, what we see is that if your demands are rooted in experiential knowledge, they're going to look different than if they're rooted in an alienated relationship with the issue itself. And so we mentioned SB 10. A bill like SB 10 could have only been designed by people who aren't impacted, because it takes nothing into account with what the potential implications of something like that are, while simultaneously emphasizing the goal to have a policy victory to fundraise off of. And these kind of cynical realities that we face sometimes in this kind of nonprofit world are usually driven by folks who aren't rooted in the realities of how policies play out in the community, in people's real lives. Impacted people are coming from the reverse analysis, where it's starting from a place of having lived the impact. And if we're making demands as a campaign, Justice LA is a campaign, for example, my organization, Dignity and Power Now, is an example. We have to be accountable to every single demand we make. We have to vet every single demand we make. We have to vet every single suggestion and policy vision that we try to create. And we have to make sure that we are pushing forward a vision that takes into account everybody and also anticipates potential unintended consequences. That kind of rigor, that kind of sophistication is going to come from impacted folks. Our campaign is vast majority impacted people. And then the other piece is that there's been a kind of dynamic that I think fortunately is disintegrating, where for a very long time there was, like you said, a kind of white collar lawyer class, executive class, usually not impacted, giving advice, telling us how to do the work, telling us what was possible, telling us what was realistic. I don't think I need to explain why that's problematic, but what's interesting to me is how backward it always was. And we still have big organizations that do it, where you're gonna hire a lawyer to run a grassroots campaign. I mean, that's like hiring me to coach the Knicks, you know what I mean? It doesn't, I mean, that's a bad example because I could probably do better than, but you get what I'm saying. And it creates like a vertigo in the work, because you have people who know what they're doing being told they have to listen to people who don't know what they're doing. And a lot of harm has been done there. The other piece of this, and this is less about policy and less about analysis and more about how we hold each other down, which is that my organization, for example, is engaged around issues of state violence all day, every day. But we're also aware that it's not just state violence, it's intercommunal violence too. And there's a lot of loss, and there's a lot of pain, and there's a lot of grief. And things like that are so personal and they're so intimate that when someone tells me how I'm supposed to feel about something, that's not the point. Because I feel 5 different ways a day about someone who did something bad to me or took somebody from me. That does not mean that I subscribe to or get manipulated into supporting state violence as an answer. I don't believe in the death penalty. I don't believe in someone being locked up. I don't believe that state punishment is accountability. But that does not mean that I have forgiven somebody or want anything to do with them or even see their humanity all the time. But it's fluid, because sometimes I do. And that space needs to be made, especially if we're going into spaces making demands, being mistreated by the press, being attacked by the police, being marginalized by people in our own field, being sold out by people in our own field. And it's okay to name names. It's okay to talk about Californians for Safety and Justice and Alliance for Safety and Justice and ACLU and Reform Alliance and Van Jones. And it's okay to name names because they're doing harm. And I've told them this myself, and I do it as lovingly and constructively as I can, because it doesn't mean I'm giving up on them and the opportunity to get right, but they're not getting right now. And we're having to maintain a space in our community where those impacts are felt by people, and not by people, the community's us. That's the other thing. If we're impacted, we're talking about ourselves. So some of us get trotted out in these spaces almost as kind of like this narrative of this bootstrap capitalism narrative of look how well we're doing. And I remember being trotted out in front of a funder one time with a couple other people, and they were talking about like, I'm in college now, and I'm this, and I'm that. And I remember I stopped, and I was like, the majority of our folks are not doing okay. And we have loved ones, we don't know where they are. We have loved ones who are homeless. We have loved ones who are locked away. We have loved ones who are dead. And it's because of these systems that we quite frankly can undo. In many cases, if you just get out of the way, because we are experts in this, and we are able to formulate and develop strategy and policy analysis and get a thing done. So I say all that because when we build appropriate containers to hold each other's grief and be there for each other when we feel sold out, when we feel bitter, when we feel angry, and to also acknowledge that just because you're an abolitionist or just because you're against state violence doesn't mean that it's all good.
Thank you, Lex. Thank you, Lex. I wanna also answer this on the youth justice front when it comes to directly impacted folk, and all of you brought something very important that we've been grappling with a lot. And again, I say this as a 27-year-old, formerly incarcerated young person, and I've only been out 7 years. And although polished and whatever I might be right now, like I have struggled a lot in the last 7 years with mental health, with finances, with issues at home, with housing for my family. There have been issues that I've been experiencing even as a father as well, right? I'm a father to an 11-year-old, right? So y'all can do the math, how old I was when she was born, right? But I think part of what has happened for me, and I'd like for all of us to also understand, is that in the directly impacted work, when we start saying that, whether it's for all of these campaigns or all of this work that you all are a part of, or even in the youth justice front, right? We're trying to engage people who oftentimes are still in the middle of a lot of the issues that we're talking about, right? Whether it's Ruben now openly saying, he's currently on parole, right? Like these things are close to home. And I've had to deal with the simple fact that I'm trying to organize young people to close youth prisons while they're actually currently on supervision, while they're currently about to get evicted, while some of them are legitimately calling me sometimes and saying, I'm like ready to give it up, bro. I'm like ready to hang it up. And I say that on like a very serious note because as much as we're doing all this work to close some of these institutions, we're also trying to actively repair and heal from the harm that these institutions have already caused, right? And I think that as we're actively building this collective movement around closure, we need to grapple with that, right? We need to grapple with the fact that the harm has already been caused. And so how do we actively have not just a narrative of closure, but a narrative of healing while pushing for that closure, right? While pushing for some of this transformative work and ultimately sometimes for the repurposing, right? How do we reinvest dollars into that healing strategy or that healing solution that oftentimes for many is not the thing that is going to be advocated for just at the immediate, because one, we're not saying close things down and all of a sudden, let everybody completely out without any support, right? But we're equally not saying just lock people up and throw away the key. And I think that one of the things that we've done at Youth First and that I've had to grapple with as the youth partnership strategist, because what that really means is I get to work with all the young people in each of our state partners. And I think part of what I have grappled with is not only the fact that these young people are so full of creativity. One example that I have is in Philly, actually, I did a what we call visioning sessions. So when we say community-led and community sort of demands that come from the community, we do these visioning sessions where we walk young people through what the system is like and then ask them very directly, if you had $150,000, which is what it might cost for one young person to be housed for 1 year in that state, what would you do with that money? And nothing that they mention ever comes to a facility or a program in a facility or anything having to do with a facility. It always has to do with housing. It always has to do with employment. It always has to do sometimes, a car or a World Star video. God knows what things young people will say. But I will never forget in Philly, one young man one time hit me with I would build paintball courts in all the communities around Philly. And I immediately, again, I'm 27 now, so I was like, I didn't check myself in that moment. I'm like, well, but what about something else? Something that is going to teach you something? And in that moment, that kid immediately replied back and said, well, I said paintball course because that way we were shooting each other with paintballs as opposed to bullets and nobody would die. And that was a reality check for me in terms of the idea and the solution that came out of this young man for gun violence in Philly had nothing to do with me saying, you need work, you need job, you need all of these educational opportunities. He was just trying to think about a way to not have to die from a bullet, right? And so I say that specific example, and I repeat that example because that day I checked myself on the fact that as I continue to learn from all the folk who are doing this work and actively learn too to be an abolitionist and also to heal while doing this work, that the work to close jails, prisons, detention centers, and youth prisons is work that requires us to collectively do more than just organize to close, but actively do work to heal each other and to support each other. And I wanna echo that for everybody in this room, because as all of you, sort of leave this room, you're gonna have to think about ways maybe that you wanna get engaged, and we have a whole panel here for that, right, that you can actively plug into. But I do wanna sort of end off and give everybody an opportunity to close us off with the simple, not even simple, but the challenging task of thinking about what is the vision for each of you, and how does this closure conversation tie into that, while simultaneously wrapping that up around with some piece of advice that you would give to other folk here in this room who maybe want to engage in some of this conversation and be a part of these movements to close some of these places down. And so that's a fully loaded question, and I say that very intentionally because I want to make sure that we really wrap this up in a powerful way. And I'm open to any of you taking a stab at it.
I know for me, part of our campaign has been to reinvest in the community. So, again, I agree with you. It's not just about closing the jail. It's about taking those resources, and there are a lot of resources, and I'm talking specifically about Philadelphia, but across the country, there's a lot of resources that are diverted from our communities into criminal justice, into Department of Corrections. In Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, while we were building a $400 million prison, they were closing 29 schools. So you can connect the dots and see lack of priorities, and you can also guess where those schools were. But you can connect the dots and see lack of priorities for resources and services and opportunities in our communities. So for us, part of our reinvestment plan means taking the money that is saved from closing the jail and put it into whatever it may be, a paintball court in North Philly, a therapy for people coming out of prison to really unpack some of their trauma, a safe house for women in violent relationships, the violent partner relationship, education, whatever it may be. The community can decide those things. We don't necessarily have to come up with the perfect solution for everything. We're saying that these jails don't work. We're saying that you're being irresponsible to our communities, both financially and socially, and we want to change that. So for us, that's the focus of what we envision happen. Do I believe that we're in a world that prisons won't exist? I believe that there was a time when prison didn't exist. And I think they exist because of capitalism. I think they exist because of racism. And I think that we can change those things. And if people had all that they needed, if their needs were met, then we can erase some of those situations to lead to prison. And I think that it's hard for elected officials to wrap their head around that because they're quote unquote constituents. don't support that, but guess what? We're constituents too.
Yeah.
We're registered voters too. And we got to mobilize in that way to make our voices resonate even louder.
Thank you, Ruben. Marilyn?
Okay, so to pick up where Ruben left off, we're not just their constituents, we're their boss.
There you go.
We're their boss. We can determine whether you sit there or you're voted out. But I want to say that for us, as far as the healing space, we believe in healing at Women on the Rise. And that's why this is a community-led project. If you go to closetojail.atl.org website, you will see the whole model of not imaging, but renderings and ideas from the community of what they want this building to be. It's on our website. We have these meetings once a month, and it's the community that is deciding, I want a basketball court, I want a quiet room, I want education, I want temporary housing, I want child care. All of this stuff is what they're asking for to be in this 471,000 square feet building, which is a city within itself. It's just that large. And in our organization, like I said, it's all formerly incarcerated women. There is a therapist that we have that they can go to, our members can go to. So we believe in healing. We do generous somatics. We do bowl. We do all of the things that keep us safe, keep us whole, and try to erase some of the trauma that we've been through as formerly incarcerated women. And this is a part of our legend, part of what we do as women.
Thank you, Marilyn.
I think I would want to start off by saying that migration isn't always beautiful. I feel like people love saying like, oh, it's a human right, it's so beautiful, but no, a lot of the times it's forced, and we have to understand why, like where that comes from, and the role of U.S. policy in a lot of us being displaced. I had to leave my home country because of guerrilla warfare that was in many ways created and funded by the United States. So for us, it's about thinking about freedom of movement, but also why movement is coerced and why folks end up here in the first place, and recognizing that the U.S. has the largest immigrant detention system in the world, but it's also like a blueprint for everything that's happening everywhere else. Like Europe is really ramping up the detention of immigrants. India is trying to strip Muslim folks of their citizenship to detain them and eventually, you know, get rid of them there. So yeah, recognizing those like global ties and how it particularly affects migrant populations. And recognizing things like ICE was created on March 1st of 2003. Most of us are older than that. Most of us have lived a life without ICE, without a militarized force that detains and deports and disappears our families and holds them for ransom. And ICE is also the largest police force in the United States with the least amount of like training or accountability. Like they're just, not to say that any of them are good, obviously all police are horrible, but there's a particular aspect of ICE and how they've been built up in a period of like 17 years to be such a force in the United States. So yeah, for us it's like recognizing that and envisioning a world where like immigrants and folks don't need to be detained for any reason, and it's more about like resourcing our communities and creating avenues for people to feel welcomed, to stay, but also allowed to leave and come back as they please.
Thank you, Barbara.
I think that, you know, we're up here, I've said to you before, like, let's just come tell the truth. And that's what I believe in, is that what we're talking about here are all very much the just and sensible and correct outcomes to ask for. And if you put it on the table to have a debate about, you can't lose. We, you know, a microcosm of what I'm saying is that we often welcome our opposition in LA County to come fight us on things, tell probation to come, tell the sheriffs to come, because we're putting the truth on the table. And so if they want to argue with it, what surfaces is the fact that this is a vision that's better for all people versus a particular set of self-interests. And that doesn't mean it's not a difficult obstacle to navigate or overcome, but it's really useful when this truth gets surfaced. And so my hope all the time is that we don't kind of thwart our own progress because of our fear of being direct with each other, because of our fear of being honest with each other, because of our fear of conflict. And in that sense, I'm very much a radical optimist in that I believe conflict creates tremendous opportunity, but it requires accountability on all sides and really being able to stand on what we say and stand on what we ask for. So I'm thinking a lot about that and how I navigate leaning into those things, and simultaneously, how do we contend with our own hurt? How do we contend with our own bitterness? I'll tell you guys something that I'm realizing is a layer to this work that I hope we can kind of catch up with, which is the gentrification and economic justice component. Because I'm going through some bitterness right now. Like, am I making LA better for the wrong people? Because I'm losing my community so fast. And I'm still happy with what we're achieving, but I'm also just feeling like, am I subconsciously looking away from that too much because I'm focused? And knowing that we have to do something about that, and knowing that part of why I'm feeling that is because it's really heartbreaking for me to see that happening to my neighborhoods. And I know that's the same everywhere. And we didn't say, hey, let's do criminal justice reform. This is not a siloed set of issues. Those were arbitrary silos that have nothing to do with the reality of how these impacts are felt. And we use this term intersectionality a lot. Like, that term's a reaction to that siloing. Like, we shouldn't have to call it intersections. There aren't separate lanes. It's the same thing. And this holistic approach to me is what's effective. And so I'm feeling challenged and feeling motivated to try and really address that component of things, because, you know, the current iteration of capitalism has reached such a grotesque level to where now in every city across the country, we have thousands of vacancies next to thousands of houseless people. And it doesn't get any more obvious than that. And so I'm hoping we can pick up that ball collectively too. And I'm not subscribing an answer to that, certainly not one that's singular, other than what I started with, saying that we can assess things and assess things historically. And I want to incorporate that into our current work while we happen to be winning so much. But that's definitely a big piece of that. And extending that I'm feeling grief about that. I'm being vulnerable and telling y'all I'm feeling grief about making my city better for people who I didn't mean to make it better for.
Thank you, Lex. Thank you for that, for being truthful, right? Because it's true. I think we're all starting to grapple with that in many of the conversations. And even at Youth First, we're grappling with that with all these repurposing conversations, right? Like, who's actually benefiting from the work that we're doing? And so we have a few minutes. If people have some questions for the panel directly, I would appreciate if you actually ask an actual question as opposed to, go on a rant. So if people are interested in asking a question, please do say so, and I'll walk over to you with the mic. Oh, we'll go this way and then that way.
Sorry, Lex, I just had to ask one question about the intersectionality comment. What did you mean exactly by that? Like, we're all in the same lane? Like, could you bump it down for me a little bit? Because that part, like, I got confused when you said
Sure.
that we were all in the same.
I'll say it as how I meant it.
Yeah,
And how I understand it, because again, I feel like these terms get used so much that sometimes I'm not sure anymore if I even understand it right. But when people talk about, oh, we got it, I work in issues around housing. I work in immigration. I work on criminal justice reform. I work on public health. I work on food justice. I work on environmental justice. And then that also gets kind of like composed with and against people's own terms of identification, who I am, what my background is, how I identify, and how that's prioritized. And, hierarchies of values get attached to that, justifiably so. But the issue side of that conversation, those distinctions were not made by us. I don't know why we started saying criminal justice reform as if it exists on an island separate from houselessness. One absolutely creates the other and vice versa. It's an ecosystem that is actually quite obvious when we sit and think about it. And so I was saying that I'm contending with the fact that we are stopping jailing in LA. And we also have more homeless folks, houseless folks in LA than anywhere. And there's plenty of houses. And it has nothing to do with, the solutions not being in plain sight. It has to do with something very wrong with a current political setup. And that I want to address that as if they're not separate issues. And so I'm thinking about, in the same way that why did folks tolerate pretrial jailing for so long? Right. why are we tolerating this and why is it not being folded completely into our work? And I'm sitting with that right now.
Okay, sorry. I was thinking of a different definition of the term, so that's where I got confused. But thank you for explaining that.
Hi, Miss Marilyn. Um, when you decided to close the jail, which came first, the repurposedness of the jail? Did you figure out what you were going to do if the jail got closed first, or did that come after the jail closed? Did you all say, okay, now what we going to do with it?
No, they came basically at the same time. It was, it's like I'm just a true believer that if you're closing anything, well, I'm just say jails. I believe in with our population of people being in jail, we have a jail that's overcrowded, and I know that if this jail is not closed, some type of way, that jail is going to be intersected and migrate over into this jail.
Right.
I'd rather see it torn down and grass grow.
Okay.
So, but the thought was they came together. But for my thought, it came together. But when my organization built a community-led project, it became the community's idea of what it would be. We just gave it a name.
So did you get feedback from the city on, okay, if we close it, what are you going to do? How did you approach them to get them to do that?
Well, like I said, it was community led. We built a 50 alliance membership base. We turned up and we called it, what was it? Day of Redemption. We took over the city hall of Day of Redemption, and all of these alliance members and their members came to the city hall. We went around to each council member's office. We didn't ask for meetings. We went in the meetings and demanded the meetings. It was too many of us for them to just say no, 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 no. So, but they gave us the permit to have the event in the city hall, but they didn't know what the event was.
Okay.
So we kind of like took over the city hall. It was the Day of Redemption, the day of taking over the city hall, and we had those meetings. And so that's where we got the opportunity to actually sit down with the mayor and give her our idea and thoughts. My mayor is impacted as well, so she kind of in a way came aboard, and her exact words was, "This was a divine order," and so we went from there.
Good stuff.
Thank you. You have one here, and then I have 2 questions. I'm sorry, just 2 more.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering if you see any of you the effort to close the jails as separate from an effort to stop new jails from being opened. And then it's a little bit of a multi-part question. And then I was wondering if you think that there's enough of a national infrastructure for coordinating the work that you all do.
That's a big one right there.
It is.
To the first part of your question, every time you make progress on the front of kind of stopping incarceration or decarcerating or stopping jails, you reach a point and then they put something on the table back. And it's this kind of negotiation, and you have to take this risk of like, if we reject this, what happens? And every jurisdiction, every campaign, every area deals with its own set of conditions around that. And so I can only speak to one, that they're always going to try. So we've successfully stopped 3 jails in LA with no plans to build a new one, and we know though that they're still going to try. They're going to try to find new ways, new creative ways to build places that cage people. And even though there's nothing right now in any of the text or the results of our campaigns that says they'll do it, we can't stop and act like we stopped it. And we also know that when they put that back on the table, there's going to be people telling you, just take what you can get, this is still better. And we also know that there is a numbers conversation that's valid, where amidst all of this, the more we stay pushing, even if there are outcomes that feel compromised and bad, with the numbers going further and further down, we know that benefits public safety, and that becomes its own really difficult and complicated conversation with what value we apply to those outcomes. But I would say that the other thing is that some of us inherit different realities in our campaigns than others. And so sometimes you step into something where a deal already got struck and you have to inherit those conditions. In our case, we inherited something where the votes already happened. So we had to, deal with those conditions. And so I think that the effort should always be to not have any jail built, and there should also always be an awareness that they're gonna try to build something like a jail, no matter what. And this goes into a deeper conversation about implementation, which is that we really, I hate when people say we have to, but I'm gonna say it anyway. We have to stop celebrating our wins when nothing's even been implemented. I've seen organizations pass a great policy or campaign and then leave to do a victory lap or fundraise or grow their org and not be stewards of implementation, and either it doesn't happen at all, law enforcement goes and cuts the corners and does everything they can to stop it, or it gets done very poorly. And I've had funders say to me like, well, implementation's not sexy. And I didn't know any of this was sexy, first of all, but second of all, that's a failure. And again, when I said earlier about leaning back into conflict, I hope we can say that back to folks, that implementation's everything, and it's also the most exciting opportunity for organizing. So if there was an outcome in New York, for example, around closed Rikers, there's opportunity now where it's landed in implementation, where I hope folks come back together and organize the hell out of that opportunity rather than stay and fight each other, because there's still so much that can be won.
Thank you, Lex. Yeah.
I just want to say I think that closing the jail goes hand in hand with preventing new jails from being prevented. So again, talking about intersectionality, let's not create silos and let's not create subdivisions. The reality is we talk about not criminalizing black and brown people, not putting people in cages. So the same way, and so I want you to think about criminalizing black and brown people like a water faucet, right, in your house or apartment, and it's leaking. So you can keep putting a bucket under there catching that water, or you can cut off the water supply, right? So the 13th Amendment criminalized black people coming out of slavery. The war on poverty and drugs criminalized black and brown whole communities. The Patriot Act criminalized, quote unquote, Americans across the country who could be labeled terrorists, right? ICE is criminalizing Latino communities and immigrant populations. So if we focus on how do we stop our communities from being criminalized, from being punished, from being locked in cages, then that's the road to victory for me. Yeah, in the meantime, we got to get our people out of cages. So that's why we want to close prisons. Ultimately, we don't want people held in cages, so it has to be a multi-level fight. So getting people out and cutting off that water supply that criminalizes our people.
Thank you, Ruben. So that being said, I want to wrap us up and want to really emphasize the fact that we can't get to everything on this panel, right? In an hour and a half, we can't unpack what it means to close an institution down or the strategies that have come into doing that. And so I encourage all of you to really, if you have questions, to come to our panelists, including myself on the Youth Justice Front. I keep talking about it as if I'm not a panelist. To actively engage with us in this dialogue, but ultimately to continue this conversation and acknowledging that the closure piece is a crucial element of all of the work that we're all striving for. And again, leaving us with the question, can we reimagine a world, again, where prisons are not the first and last solution? And keeping us with that mentality in mind as you proceed through the rest of this conversation. But join me all in thanking these panelists for their efforts. And with that, y'all are free.